What is up, guys? Welcome on back to the news with TK. Well, it seems that China is actually starting to buckle, and not just from unconfirmed reports or stuff that we see from people posting in Chinese social media every day. This is coming from us at home as we're looking at the numbers. Their real estate market in China right now is in shambles. And not just that, but now with over 20% of their GDP generated by them selling us products, millions of workers are getting layoff notices every single day. The pressure cooker in China is growing every single day. Remember, they said, we're not negotiating, we will fight to the end. And now we're seeing that the message coming out of China is softening. Roll the clip.
All right, President Trump may be starving out China's Xi Jinping with the tariffs. Joining us now is a great friend of mine, former Trump Deputy National Security Advisor, Matt Pottinger. First of all, Matt, it's wonderful to see you. Thank you for doing this.
Hey, Larry, how are you?
We appreciate this very, very much. One of the headlines today, tough talking China could be opening the door to tariff talks. And as you probably know, as a China expert, they're closing factories in China at a record rate. Their exports are way down. I mean, you know, we're their biggest customer. And at least for the moment, with 145% tariffs, we've kind of shut off business with them. Now, what do you think they're going to do? How do you read this, Matt Pottinger?
Yeah, so Larry, you're right. Look, China, about 20% of their exports go to the United States. So they really do need this market. And by the way, the older elements of their market, the older elements of their economy that used to carry that economy are not working very well. Their real estate market is a mess. Their consumer economy is, people are scared to spend, and that's been true for years now. Foreign direct investment has fallen over the last couple of years. So they need their export markets more than ever. And the United States is the most important single market for them. So where does this end? I noticed that the Chinese minister in charge of trade had his spokesman put out a statement that seemed like a slightly softer statement overnight than the one that we'd heard a week or two ago. A week or two ago, they said President Trump would have to remove his unilateral tariffs, as they called them, as a precondition for talks. Now they're saying they would like President Trump to show sincerity that he would be prepared to remove tariffs. So I think that we're finding our way fumbling toward some kind of a negotiation in coming weeks. And I imagine there will be some kind of a mutual de-escalation. That's my best guess. But we're not going back. I just don't see President Trump going back to his pre-inauguration level of tariffs. He's going to maintain particularly high tariffs for China throughout his presidency.
You remember well, Matt, you know, for 2.5 years, we negotiated with China on the so-called Phase 1 deal, okay? Lighthizer was our leader, Mnuchin, myself, Wilbur Ross, et cetera, et cetera. We signed that thing in January 2020 amidst way too much ballyhoo. And it turns out, by most accounts, China never lived up to that Phase 1 deal, okay? They're still stealing intellectual property. They're still forcing technology transfers. They're not buying the commodities, either the manufacturing, even the farm stuff. In other words, they didn't make good on the deal. So I think, and I hope President Trump remains very tough with them because, you know, memories are long. And that memory of that deal is very disappointing. You think that we're going to just jump in and say, I mean, there's people on Wall Street that want us to have, you know, go back to zero tariffs with China. Why should we do that? I don't think we should do that.
Yeah, no, well, I'm with you on that. I would say that the great innovation of that deal that President Trump and Bob Lighthizer and Steve Mnuchin and you were all involved in supporting the president in that Phase 1 agreement. The thing that was great about that agreement was it was the first time that the United States maintained these punitive tariffs as part of the deal. So in other words, the tariffs would not come off until China had made good on it. So that was a real innovation. But of course, even with that innovation, Beijing did not make good on its word, and that's because it's a communist party. You know, communist dictators don't usually keep their word, and I think President Trump knows that. And
everybody tells me Xi Jinping has ever more control over the country, over the economy, over the Communist Party. People say he thinks he's emperor. He thinks he's even bigger than Mao Zedong. What is your impression of what's going on there?
Yeah, look, I don't think he's leaving power unless it's for his own funeral, and so we've got a long time to go potentially with Xi Jinping. But I think he's out of touch, right? I mean, if you're in a system where you don't have to worry about voters, you don't have to worry about polls. There's no Fox News equivalent, that he's watching on TV. He controls everything more or less that gets broadcast, or even what is permitted to carry on the internet. So I think he's out of touch. When you get into that rarefied air, it's like being on the summit of Mount Everest. The oxygen gets pretty thin, and I don't think he's fully grasping all the dimensions of how his own economic policy, centralizing control into the hands of the Communist Party, into his own hands, how much damage that's done when you're dealing with 1.3 billion human beings, right? You can't control successfully what 1.3 billion people do.
I mean, he's wrecked their economy. He's basically wrecked their economy, right? Not so 20 years ago, 30 years ago, all those free market reforms, most of that stuff is off the boards. He's using all this, money, government money, for these state-owned companies and squeezing the entrepreneurs out. In fact, throwing some entrepreneurs into jail. Matt Podger, let me raise one more point. We talked about this yesterday. Trump administration is now putting secondary sanctions on Iranian oil purchases. Their biggest financier, as you know, is China. I think the number was China, 90% of Iranian oil was purchased by China. So secondary sanctions, which says you cannot do any business with the United States, that's really a slap in the face of China. Does that have any particular meaning in this? It hurts Iran. I'm glad about that, but it may hurt China, too.
Well, I'll tell you something. First of all, it's a return to President Trump's maximum pressure strategy, which I think was the right policy then, and it's the right policy now. The Biden years, the Middle East policy of the Biden administration was particularly rough going and unproductive. So this is setting the stage for President Trump to potentially see if Iran's willing to put anything on the table. I would only add that Iran isn't much better at keeping its end of deals than the Chinese are, the Chinese Communist Party is. But I will say this idea of secondary sanctions on China is a really, really powerful one in another context, Larry. And that is that the sanctions that the United States has on Russia right now are actually very, very important because they ensure that Chinese banks don't tie up even more closely with the Russian financial system.
So they're
afraid of secondaries.
Right. So that could be a huge card. And the mineral deal puts us really in Ukraine. American companies developing in Ukraine has got to be some kind of security buffer zone, unless Putin is truly out of his mind, which maybe he is. I don't know. You know more about that than I do. But I see the mineral deal as a big plus. Give you the last word on that one.
I like it. It shows that the United States has a stake now. I mean, it will help satisfy President Trump's desire to always be reimbursed.
Now, look, I like Larry Kudlow. I think he's a pretty good when it comes to economic issues or an economist. And I think he makes a lot of sense. If you look at or talk to any Chinese expert or somebody that understands the culture or where they're, how things work there, I speak the language, so I have a decent idea on how culture works, especially with the CCP. And it's very interesting to see China, for the first time in my lifetime, soften their tone or backpedal a little bit. You know what I'm saying? Like, normally they'll keep stuff like, yo, this F it, this is what it is, and they just deal with the consequences for 6 months. But where the government is so revolved around Xi Jinping, like as you saw in the clip, he considers himself at like emperor status. And what Xi Jinping also knows about the CCP is they will move you aside. And when it starts messing with their pockets, their way of life, the same way that for thousands of years that dictators have been deposed or moved to the side, whether you were Julius Caesar or somebody else, it doesn't matter. It will be your own people that get you. I thought this was an interesting clip to bring to you because it talks a lot. You know, it really goes to the heart of the trade war, so to speak, with China. And I think now that China knows that a deal with India is imminent, they do not, absolutely do not want to have a stronger India south of them. They don't. They would much rather continue business as it is, even if they have to pay a little bit more for that business with the Trump administration, and just try to wait out for another administration. That's the smart play for them. And I think that's where they're getting to now. Let me know what you guys think in the comment section down below. Give the video a big thumbs up if you like what I do. Hit the subscribe button if you haven't already. And as always, stay petty, my friends.